Good evening, guys. How are we doing today? Now, today I want to do something that I do once in a while, which is to analyze and criticize a presentation that we saw being done for Zimbabwe just the other day. Mwale, how are you? Sarah, Kahiso, Dr. Clarence, I see you guys. Hey, Sima, what's up, Bouse? Tongai, how are you, bro? Mwale, I see you there, my man. Ian, Joachim, how are you, brother? Bruce Ngube, great to see you, my brother. So I want us to go through the exercise of going through the presentation that was given by Dr. Dendera, or Dendera, the other day. I don't know how to pronounce it. The Americans are saying Dendera, but I know in Zimbabwe we've got Dendera, but I also know it's possible that it could be Dendera. So I would like somebody who understands how to fix that to fix it. I'm going to give an analysis of what it is that I thought about of her presentation. Earlier on today on her page, somebody commented and he was swearing, basically saying that I think your presentation was nonsense. And she was a bit affected by that. And I was very quick. Hello, Angela. Philip, how are you? I was very quick to say to Dr. Dendera, the moment you go into the public sphere and the moment you make comments that affect a nation, a people, or a public, you must now expect that you've become a public figure. And in the same way that politicians are criticized, you yourself are going to get criticized. And when you do get criticized, just make sure that you do not get pissed off. Marigold, how are you? Wiggling. Elise Sumbana, wow, I haven't seen you in a while, Elise. So, in the same spirit, I would like to make this presentation and critique the presentation that Ms. Dendera came up with. And when I say critique, it doesn't mean necessarily condemning. Critique means an analysis and critically analyzing the presentation that she gave us. I have said a number of times, and one of the major reasons I'm taking the time to make this presentation is I've said a number of times that as African intellectuals, particularly those with PhD degrees, we find ourselves being administrators of colonial interests much more than we serve our own people. By this I mean, for instance, if you look at the people with PhDs, a lot of them work for foreign Western NGOs. And we all know what NGOs stand for. They work for foundations from Western corporations. And we all know what they stand for. To a certain extent, in my eyes, that is institutionalizing or administrating colonialism. And so in that spirit, I'm making this analysis. So Ms. Dendera was invited to the United States to a Congressional commission that was looking at the relationship between the new government of Zimbabwe and the United States government. What they were trying to assess is whether the United States government can change its outlook and policy on the Zimbabwean government and be able to lift sanctions from the Zimbabwean government. Now, what I found very interesting or ironic about this particular commission is it was a commission presiding over sanctions in Zimbabwe. Those of you that have been paying attention over this last 17 years, a lot of US officials, European officials, our opposition party members, and sometimes even our political analysts have all been denying that Zimbabwe is under sanctions. However, our good doctor, Chipo, went all the way to the United States to sit on a congressional commission that was sitting to hear about sanctions that don't exist. A lot of people have been congratulating her that she has done a fantastic job to be sitting in a US Congress. I'm going to be a little bit analytical. A lot of our Zimbabwean friends will say, maybe I'm a hater. The point is, I'm going to be analytical. I'm less interested about her sitting in front of Americans, presenting our national issues to another government. I'm more interested in what she said and how that impacts or influences the normal Zimbabwean. This is the reason I'm doing this video. I'm not doing this video to indict her, to embarrass, to support. I am doing it on a purely intellectual basis of analyzing and assessing what she said. Now, the one thing that education must do for us is it must give us the power of analysis, rationale, thought, inquisition, and assist us to make decisions that benefit us. If you look at all other PhDs from all across the world, PhDs in Europe, PhDs in America, PhDs here in South Africa for the white South African government, all of them instituted policies, documents, theses, and books to advance their nations. But the question is, our good doctor and other doctors that have found themselves sitting in front of an American Congress pertaining to Zimbabwe and its sanctions, have they done anything to advance the progress of Zimbabwe or otherwise? Do they advance their nation's interest, or do they advance the interests of the American government or other competitors? Now, the very first thing that educated people will know all across the world is that the world is about competition between nations and races for resources. All the white races know this, and all educated countries all across the world that are educated have a nationalist interest to serve their own interest before any other interest. They will even serve national interest before they serve human rights interests. They will serve their own interests before they serve justice. The very first thing that Chipo said in her presentation is she gave credit to the United States government as the biggest donor to Zimbabwe. In that presentation, she said that the United States government had donated $1 billion to the Zimbabwean government and to the nation of Zimbabwe from the year 2001 to date. What she was basically saying is she's thankful that the United States government has been a donor to Zimbabwe, which it has put under sanctions. She conveniently did not raise in that argument the fact that it is estimated that Zimbabwe has lost anything between $25 billion and $30 billion because of the sanctions that have been instituted on the country. In her academic analysis, in her educated analysis, and as she kept saying, my expert opinion, she forgot to quote that Dembisa Moyo, another doctor in economics, has been saying for the past decade that Africa does not need donors. It does not need donations. What Africa needs is a fair opportunity to compete in the world economy, make its own money, and progress its own people. It doesn't need donor funds. What she also conveniently forgot is the only reason we're getting donor funds from the United States is that they've stopped us from being able to compete fairly in the international marketplace by the sanctions that they've instituted. Not only that, by Zimbabwe not getting reparations from England after colonialism, after 90 years of colonialism, Zimbabwe did not have any money to be able to take its country forward. For having to cover the debts of the ex-Rhodesian government, our nation didn't have the resources to be able to take itself forward. Soon after that, she went and started talking about Matabeleland. Let me call it the Matabeleland issue. But she called it the Matabeleland genocide. it needs to be put clear and on record that there is no legal commission, there is no court, there is no body that has ever made a conclusion that Matabeleland was a massacre. The facts on the ground were there was fighting in a nation. In 1988, two parties sat down, two parties disarmed, and two parties had an armistice, sat down and had a discussion and ended the hostilities. In all purposes, it actually looks more like a war than a genocide. But my opinion doesn't matter. The opinion that matters is right now there's a truth commission that is taking place that the new government has instituted to try and find out and come up with conclusions as to what was it that happened in Matabeleland. Was it a war? Was it a massacre? Was it a genocide? So my question is, why did she not bring up these arguments? Why didn't she alert the US government that the Matabeleland situation is still being assessed so that we know what it is? Why did she automatically use the terms that are usually used by Western propaganda and Western media when they're standing against Zimbabwe? She then went on to express and say, government aid from the United States to the government of Zimbabwe is not what is going to develop Zimbabwe economically without economic reforms. I agree fully with that point. But I would have also expected her to go a step further and say that the one biggest stumbling block when it comes to the reforms that need to happen in Zimbabwe is the taking away of the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. Because the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe are the biggest cause of the lack of business and economic development in Zimbabwe. And of those sanctions that are on Zimbabwe, there are two sanctions that are there. There is the Dendera sanctions, where Zimbabwe, through the power of the United States to influence its directors in the IMF and international lending agencies and the banking system, Zimbabwe has been excluded from the world international banking system. And they've been excluded from the multilateral lending institutions where they can negotiate for the reduction of debt. Zimbabwe cannot even ask for the reduction of debt, of the Rhodesian debt that was spent on fighting our fathers and mothers. And those are issues that I expected Dendera to bring up and point out to the United States government. The other sanctions that were instituted by George Bush using presidential powers to make an order are the ones that are against our politicians. I have no problem with those particular sanctions. So there are two sanctions. There's one set of sanctions that takes Zimbabwe out of the financial system of the world. These affect the common citizen of Zimbabwe. These stop the common citizen of Zimbabwe from getting medicine. They stop Zimbabwe from able to finance the sanitation, the roads, the development of its nation, and to deliver services for its citizens. Those are problematic. She never brought that up. She then went on to talk about elections. And she said the problem right now in Zimbabwe is we've got a media, a national media that favors the ruling party. And that media is also coupled with a security system that is partisan to the ruling party. And that situation creates a condition where we cannot have free and fair elections. I totally agree with her. But within that, she also forgot to highlight the fact that sanctions that have been instituted on the government, a government that is incumbent and a government that has got a ruling party, also inconvenience the ruling party and also create conditions that do not allow free and fair elections. And in such a condition, where there are elections that have been instituted in order to prevent the government from giving services to its people, so that people can be pushed to vote for the opposition, those conditions also facilitate elections that are not going to be free and fair. But not only that, they push our government to also look for advantages to mitigate the disadvantages created by those conditions. So these are issues that she did not bring up. Analysis that I would expect somebody who's got a doctorate to have undertaken. She then went on to say to mitigate the problem of this biased state media, the United States government must sponsor independent media. People like VOA, the Voice of America, and other institutions that can give a balance for the opposition. What I didn't like about that is she fails to acknowledge that we've got Kwese in Zimbabwe. And Kwese allows for an opinion that is independent from that of government. We've got various non-governmental newspapers in the country, various online media that support the alternative narrative. Why now should America just sponsor the Voice of America in new institutions or new organizations when we already have them? She then talks about corruption. And when she talks about corruption, she says that Zimbabwe loses between $1 billion and $2 billion. Now, she was saying throughout the presentation in her expert opinion. So as an expert, how can she not know the figure and have such a deviation from 1 billion to 2 billion? If these figures are verified, why is there such a huge standard deviation that basically makes our number a now number? Shouldn't she have given a more credible figure? And if she couldn't give a credible figure, then was she giving figures that she's sure of, or was she guessing? She went on again to mislead the United States Congress by saying 15 billion disappeared, insinuating the 15 billion that disappeared from diamonds. We all know by now that Zimbabwe did not produce 15 billion of diamonds. And for those of you that still believe that Zimbabwe produced 15 billion of diamonds that were stolen, plus another 6 billion of diamonds that were then sold legitimately on the market, you're basically insinuating that Zimbabwe was able to put a 15% increase of diamond onto the market, but that did not affect the price because instead, between that very same period, the prices of diamond went up by 20%. Rough diamond went up by 20%. Not only that, but Zimbabwe, after putting this glut of diamonds on the market and putting 15% extra diamonds on the market, the Kimberley process did not suspend Zimbabwe from participation. That would be highly unlikely because the Kimberley process is specifically there to stop diamonds that are not supposed to go in the market from going into the market. She then talked about how ZANU-PF keeps blaming the sanctions for its problems. And my question is, unless she has done a study, a cost-benefit analysis, a scientific study to see that Zimbabwe's problem and its economy is affected by sanctions and not, is affected by corruption and not sanctions, how can she arrive at the conclusion that sanctions are not the reason why Zimbabwe is suffering? Particularly when you correlate that with the fact that Zimbabwe was doing well up until sanctions were instituted and up until she was removed from the IMF and multilateral lending institutions and the international banking community, which all are correlated with the influences of the United States and its sanction regime system. She then says, let's talk about sanctions. On the sanctions, she says, the US government must make clear what its policies on sanctions are when it pertains to US companies, US financial institutions relating to Zimbabwe. That was a brilliant point that she brought up. What she was saying is that Zimbabwean businesses are not being given debt by US banks. Some US companies do not transact with the Zimbabwean companies. And the question is, why? What is the policy informing this refusing to do business with Zimbabwean businesses? Because we don't find it in the Dendera Act. So the US government has got to spell out what these other measures that are affecting private businesses in Zimbabwe are. The truth of the matter is that I met a lawyer who was in Zimbabwe from the United Kingdom. And he said to me that they were looking to invest more money at AFTIS, but they couldn't invest more money at AFTIS because there's restrictions in the European policy and American policy as to the investment of private companies into Zimbabwe. So there are policies that are being instituted that are not outlined in any sanction document, not outlined in the Sanction Act, that are penalizing Zimbabwe, that are underhanded. And what she should have done was ask for the United States government to give us any disclosure whether there's another policy and extra sanctions that are not specified in the act and in the presidential the presidential order that was given by George Bush in 2003. I felt that she didn't ask the right question, and therefore she took a position to be neutral. She then says that the United States must take off sanctions, or she recommends that they must take off sanctions from government companies, because we've got a new parliament that has been given the power of oversight, and that parliament has the power to regulate the activities of government companies, so therefore there's no reason for there to continue to be sanctions. I thought that was a brilliant point. It was an excellent point. I loved it, but I believe that she set too much on trying to get businesses to have the sanctions removed, but she didn't care much about the sanctions that are affecting the man on the street in Zimbabwe. On another group of sanctions was the sanctions that have been imposed on ministers, or sanctions that have been imposed on those ministers that have been earmarked. I do believe that all sanctions that are in Zimbabwe are punitive. And I do believe that all sanctions in Zimbabwe were put for imperial reasons. However, if there's a group of sanctions that I am willing to potentially overlook or maybe even support, it's the sanctions that are targeted at ministers. And those ministers for which an issue can be given. The only problem is that when you target sanctions at people that haven't been taken to court, we are no longer sure if you're prejudicing those people or if those sanctions are actually relevant. However, people being sanctioned from going to America, people being sanctioned from going to Europe, particularly in a country like ours, as Zimbabwe, where we are nationalists, shouldn't be a problem. So those sanctions I've got no big issue about. But those sanctions being maintained, we need to remove the sanctions that are affecting the ordinary Zimbabwean who is being punished for something that he has not done by the Dendera 2001 sanctions. I believe that Chipo did not make a distinction between these two sanctions and therefore go after each and every one of them according to their own merit. On human rights abuses, Chipo says that Zimbabwe cannot focus on economic development and divorce that from human rights abuses. I've got a problem with that. The first problem that I've got with that is that Zimbabwe is not the first country to have human rights abuses, and Zimbabwe definitely is not the worst human rights abuser in the world. We've got so many nations on our continent. America itself is a great human rights abuser when it goes to bomb nations for their oil. We've got Kenya, we've got Uganda, we've got Rwanda. We've got so many nations on this continent that have atrocious human rights issues that have never been sanctioned. So the human rights issue shouldn't come up because it was not given as the reason for the Dendera 2001 sanctions. It might have been given as a reason for the sanctions or the presidential sanctions that were given to individuals, but they should be separated. The human rights issue should be separated from the sanctions on the nation. And those sanctions on the nation are the ones that actually affect and influence the economy of Zimbabwe. So when she says we cannot look at the economy of Zimbabwe and separate that from human rights issues, she is insinuating that Zimbabweans must remain under sanctions because of human rights issues, yet the person that's suffering from those sanctions, which is the ordinary Zimbabwean on the street, has never perpetrated those human rights abuses. The sanctions that deal with the people that could be doing human rights abuses are rightfully the presidential sanctions that target individuals. So why can't she make the distinction between the cancellation of Dendera and then the continuation of those individual sanctions? She then talks about the fact that human rights abuses need to end before Zimbabwe can be taken off sanctions. What she fails to recognize is the greatest abuses of humanity taking place in Zimbabwe today are because of the sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe. The reason people do not have access to medication, access to water, access to jobs, access to investment, cancellation of debt, is because of sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe wanted to give those very same poor people their land. It is important that that distinction and the purposes of instituting the 2001 Dendera sanctions must be clear, that it was because Zimbabwe took its land to give its citizens land. And so therefore, the greatest human rights abuse that is happening in Zimbabwe right now is these sanctions that affect the poorest people of our country. These sanctions that affect our country's ability to get loans, our country's ability to get cancellation of debts that shouldn't still be outstanding, and the inability for our country to be able to transact with ease. Zimbabwe has been removed from banks, 108 banks. They've stopped doing business with Zimbabwean banks. That basically means that when you transact overseas, chances of you transacting overseas as a black business person or a Zimbabwean business is very low, because very few banks are still doing business with our bank in Zimbabwe. Those are affecting the common man. Those are affecting our business people, all of whom have nothing to do with politics and all of whom have nothing to do with the issues that the United States has. She also failed to point out that those very same sanctions that are affecting the common man on the street, that affect the medication a person can get, that affect our ability to upgrade our electricity infrastructure, are because of a situation that is political. Our people are suffering for political differences. Our people are suffering because the Zimbabwean government and the American government did not get into agreement on the Congo issue and the land reform issue. She then goes on to say, on human rights abuses, just because Mugabe is gone does not mean that we must exonerate any other person that perpetrated atrocities upon the people of Zimbabwe. I fully agree. If there are ministers, politicians, who have instituted violence against their own people and atrocities against their own people, if there are ministers who have caused political violence, and if those people can be proved to have done and committed these crimes, if these people can be indicted and a charge opened, for me, it is very critical that those people need to account. But why do we make our own people account quicker, but hardly make Europeans and the people that were oppressing our people, that caused atrocities as well, that killed 35,000 Zimbabweans who were fighting for independence, fighting for freedom from a crime against humanity, which is colonialism? Why did we never hold them accountable? Why did we never hold them to account for the atrocities that they caused upon their people or upon our people? Why is it always easier for us to hold to account our own, but never to hold to account other people, particularly Europeans? This is critical because a lot of people say that the reason we cannot hold the Rhodesians accountable is that presidential immunity was given after the war. And that presidential immunity was given by Robert Mugabe. But you must also remember that after the Matabeleland issue, amnesty, the same immunity was given by Robert Mugabe again, presidential immunity, to all sides that were in the war. So why is it we can go and dig back the Gukurahundi issue when presidential immunity was given, but we can't go back and dig up the liberation struggle where presidential immunity was given? Is the immunity made by with white people more binding than the immunity that is made between Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe? Or are we saying, let's forget about the liberation struggle, let's forget about Gukurahundi, and let's start dealing with Mrambatsvina and anything else that came after that? I would like clarity on that one. The last point she made, she says America is in competition with China for Zimbabwean resources. And because America is in competition with China for Zimbabwean resources and African resources, she has spoken to a number of Zimbabweans who have shown an interest in American investment more than Chinese investment. My question is, where did she get that from? Zimbabwe was under colonialism since 1891, all the way up until 1980. The predominant funding that came to fund activities of Rhodesia were Rothschild capital, British capital, and American capital. My question is, what did American investment do for Zimbabwe from 1891 to 1980? For our parents to have decided to go to war, to walk on foot from Zimbabwe and some of the deepest parts of Zimbabwe to Zambia, and then go and train and ask for weapons and to suffer for 17 years. Why would they do that if American investment was good? And what is it that she's got against Chinese investment when China has built railways, ports, highways, high-speed trains in places like Ethiopia and Uganda? Where have you seen those kind of investments by the US government on the African continent? Which country has been developed by the United States government? South Africa is the richest country by resources sold to the world, but South Africans have a 55% poverty rate. They've got a 52% debt to GDP ratio. In the richest country in the world, the country that gave the world 55% of its gold, all of its platinum, all of its diamonds, majority. But that country doesn't even have a sovereign fund, and there's American investment. Today, when South Africans are talking about taking their land, the threats of sanctions and the threats of potential military invasion are coming from American investors. So what makes her think that American investors are better than Chinese investment? When today, Africa is flourishing and a lot of places that never had transport communication now have transport and communication because of Chinese investment. What makes her biased to American investment besides being colonized? It is very critical that if we call ourselves an educated people, we're able to analyze the things that we say. America's human rights abuses are well documented. Their attacking of nations with weapons for oil, killing children and women for oil, is well documented. So why is it that people think that the sanctions in Zimbabwe can be any more legitimate than America's attack of Congo, Iran, Iraq, or Libya? What makes them think that these sanctions are not a weapon that are being used to punish women and children so that America can have its way with our government? The failure of Chipo to totally analyze in a balanced manner what is happening in Zimbabwe, and her being biased towards the American perspective, to me made her an administrator of colonialism. Not only that, it made her somebody who has taken sides with neoliberalism against her own people. But the question is now, what does she have the PhD for if she's going to use that PhD to advance competition against her own nation? If by now, as educated as she is, she doesn't understand that the world is a competition for resources and that the Americans are not our kings, but they are competitors with us in this life of race, why is she then supporting another race and another country against her own nation? In some countries, people that have been going to sit in the Congress of the United States speaking against Zimbabwe, continuing to recommend that sanctions continue to happen, punishing the common man on the street, in a lot of countries, those people would be exiled. In some countries, those people would be arrested for treason. In Zimbabwe, either because we don't have, it's definitely not democracy, but it's because we are not politically enlightened. We let things like that go. But I believe that people like Chipo, the MDC alliance that went to see the other Congressional commission, are people that are selling out Zimbabwe for their own CVs, for their own selfish interests. The MDCs are doing it because they want power. They don't have policies to be able to remove ZANU-PF. Their only bet is to be able to continue with sanctions that are going to force people to die of hunger, and when they die of hunger, they are forced to vote for the MDC. For me, that is unfair already. But for people like Chipo, it can only be that she can take such a position that lacks analysis, a position that lacks balance, and a position that is biased towards the Americans because she wants to advance in her own personal interests. The question is, when you want to advance a country that can't look after its own black people, what are you thinking? Black Americans don't even have full rights in America, but you as a Zimbabwean feel it necessary to serve American interests. This is a country that has no human rights in its own country for its own citizens. Its citizens are shot on the street, but for some reason you think that they are benevolent, that you need to serve their personal interests. In that meantime, grandmothers, cousins, orphans, and all sorts of people are suffering in Zimbabwe because of your expert opinion that actually lacks expertise. Expert opinion that works on innuendos and gossips instead of figures, facts, numbers. That is problematic. A person with a PhD who cannot do research to verify the figures that she's going to give in an interview. A person with a PhD who gives variations and variables that make the numbers meaningless. If you do a standard deviation between 1 billion and 2 billion, the number would never make sense. It's about time that we hold people accountable. And like I said to Chipo, if she is going to go and say things, because what she possessed when she met the American Congress was she possessed more power than any minister in Zimbabwe. Right now, the thing that will make the biggest difference in Zimbabwe is sanctions. She held more power than the president of Zimbabwe sitting in that Congress. And if she managed to make an argument to remove sanctions, she would be the most powerful person to make a policy that has changed Zimbabwe in the past 17 years. But she abused that power. And then when people are angry with her, she can't understand that. Yet as an unelected person, she went to make a statement that makes political connotations for the nation of Zimbabwe. She wants the right to influence people's lives, yet she was never elected or given a mandate by the citizens of Zimbabwe. But she doesn't want to be accountable to the nation of Zimbabwe for making such decisions. That's problematic. Marigold, how are you? Marigold, say camera on them. Tongai, say hi Rutendo. How are you? Then Philip, I'm trying to see if I can find some questions. Mbia from Atlanta. How are you, Mbia? Camera on. Oh, yes. Tongai says, tell them. Yes, I'm telling them. Brown says, Tapinda, baba. Thank you, Brown. Wilgen, dead aid. Yes, dead aid, spoken about by Dembisa Moyo, who happens to be another PhD graduate, highlighting that Africa doesn't need aid. What Africa needs is fairness from the Western community to trade without any inhibitions so that we can make money. And she said that knowing that Western nations do not want us to progress. It is not a coincidence that there's sanctions on the most educated African country and sanctions on a country that was taking land to empower its people. It's so that it doesn't succeed, because it was going to succeed had they not put sanctions. We were going to succeed had they not stopped banks from succeeding and being able to lend our farmers money. That is clear. But why is it that our intellectuals continue to pretend like they don't know that that's why sanctions were put on? Edwin, how are you, bro? All right. Wilgen talks about Dembisa Moyo. Brown, Zimbabweans inherited debt. Brown, and we inherited debt. After we inherited debt, 90 years of colonialism, 90 years of the United Kingdom sucking our resources, sucking our labor, not paying our ancestors for their labor, not paying them for their ideas, not paying them for anything. Then they don't give us reparations. And then they leave us with the debt of Rhodesia, which was basically used to fight our mothers and fathers so that they could not defeat the British. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Okay, Simon asks to be on a video. Let me try, Simon. You know me, my thing is always giving me problems. So let me try and see if you can come on. Simon. If not assumption-based. Simon, I'm trying to add you. Try and make sure that your device is landscape. Tonga is Renyu. I don't know where Tonga Renews comment went to. Tonga Renew. Simon, what's happening there? Farai said, has she responded yet? Remove them. And then Onassis Bakasa says she can't go against her funders. And this is what pains me, that our intellectuals will sell their nations out for funds. But like I'm pointing out, why is it our intellectuals, the black ones, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, they sell out their people for their competitors. In countries and people who don't even accept them. Because a neo-Nazi in America will not hesitate to kill a black PhD from Africa. And I don't know if justice will be served, but they believe in serving those countries more than they serve our countries. Zimbo Guru, let the truth be spoken, brother. Right, I'm struggling to get Simon. I think I've told you guys a number of times that I am being sabotaged on this platform. I used to be able to speak to people. I struggle to speak to people now. Mwale says capitalism is synonymous with corruption. It is indeed disingenuous for some of us to suggest that sanctions are the significance. I always say to people, corruption is not the source of poverty. The most corrupt countries, which is America itself, is the most successful country in the world because of corruption. Corruption where they will attack a nation to take its oil. They will kill women and children, 500,000 Iraqis without blinking an eye so that they can get oil, so that they can put a pipeline. They will go to Afghanistan. They will kill Afghanistanis so that they can put a pipeline to extract oil from Afghanistan through to the Mediterranean. And this is what we're talking about. Corruption is the daughter of capitalism. That is just the way it is. Simon, I'm struggling to invite you. I'm sure you can see what's going on there. So it's a lie that corruption is why Zimbabwe is not doing well. Sanctions, because if the corruption was why Zimbabwe is not doing well, they can then take off the sanctions and let Zimbabwe fall apart because of corruption. They won't take off the sanctions because they know Zimbabwe won't fall apart if the sanctions are not there. So what is it that is killing Zimbabwe? You can't say it's corruption, but at the same time maintain sanctions. Right, I'll try Amos. I don't know why I can't invite you guys. I struggle. Well, I know why I can't. Facebook doesn't want me to invite you, and it's clear. But I'll try Amos. Let's see what happens. Mutuma Mawere. Amos, can you come on? Are you able to? Have you got your device landscape? And if I can't take calls, guys, I'm going to finish off here because it's pointless to talk to myself. I really would have loved to speak to other people.